I'm a 27-year-old guy who grew up in a small suburban neighborhood with my mom, dad, and older sister, who's 3 years older than me. My dad worked long hours at a local factory, and my mom picked up part-time jobs here and there to keep us afloat. We didn't have much, but it was enough to get by for a while. I used to idolize my sister. She was the loud, confident type who seemed to always get her way. But as I grew older, I realized her charm was built on manipulation, lies, guilt trips, and a mindset that the world owed her everything. By the time I was 15, and she was 18, she had already mastered the art of dodging chores, blaming me for her mess-ups, and pulling countless stunts to avoid responsibility. My parents, believing it was just sibling drama, didn't step in, and she kept getting away with it. The turning point came when we had a huge argument over cleaning the bathroom we shared. She flat out refused to do her half, and when I refused to back down, she locked herself in her room and accused me of threatening her. My parents didn't fully buy the story, but they begged me to do the chores to keep the peace. That was when I realized just how deeply I was trapped in her web of manipulation. Eventually, she moved out to live with a friend, and for a brief period, things were peaceful. But after a few months, she returned, claiming her friend was a backstabber. She moved back in, and the cycle continued. She'd cause chaos, leave, then come back. She bounced in and out of jobs, each one supposedly toxic, each boss supposedly jealous of her. But in reality, she was too lazy to stick it out and build a career. She'd ask for money under the guise of an emergency, but it always ended up funding weekend getaways or spontaneous trips. Meanwhile, I focused on my steady warehouse job. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid my bills and allowed me to save up a little. At 25, I had moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment, not far from my parents. My sister was now 28, and her most outrageous stunt yet involved convincing my mom to give her a chunk of their savings for a business venture that she swore would make us all rich. Naturally, my mom and dad were hesitant, but they caved in, hoping for once she'd get her act together. A few months later, she came crawling back, claiming to have been scammed by her business partner. There was no proof, no receipts, nothing to back her story. But somehow, my dad let it slide, probably just to keep the peace. It didn't take long for her to run out of options again. She was couch surfing at friends' places, leaving behind unpaid rent and stories of how she'd convinced people to cover her expenses, only to ghost them later. My parents were embarrassed, but felt helpless in dealing with her. It was like trying to catch a tornado. When I turned 25, she was 28, and I was beyond fed up with her behavior. I kept my distance, focused on my job, and helped my parents whenever I could, especially since they were still dealing with the mess my sister had left behind. Then, one evening, I got an unexpected call. It was my sister, crying and begging me for a place to stay, claiming she had nowhere else to go. She said everyone had wronged her, and she was desperate. She begged me to let her crash at my apartment. Part of me still felt guilty, but deep down, I was already planning how to keep her from pulling the same tricks on me. A few days later, she showed up with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag, looking like she was planning to stay forever. Before she could start unloading her things, I laid down the ground rules. She had to contribute to rent or at least pay for groceries, and she had to stay out of my personal space. I also made it clear that messing with my mail was a deal-breaker. She acted like I was being unreasonable and sarcastically asked if I was going to make her sign a contract. I told her it was take it or leave it. She huffed and reluctantly agreed. After all, she had no other options. The next few days, she spent her time lounging around, watching TV, scrolling on her phone, and complaining that no one would hire her because everyone was out to get her. I gave her a week to show me proof of job applications, but she blew me off and acted like I was the villain. Things took a turn when she started texting my mom, claiming that I was threatening to throw her out. My mom called me upset, but I explained everything. Dad backed me up, telling me not to let her manipulate me. Sure enough, a few days later, I came home early to find my bedroom door ajar. I walked in to find her rummaging through my nightstand. She'd already grabbed an old pair of headphones and was looking for more things to take. I cleared my throat, and she jumped, trying to act innocent and claim she was just looking for a charger. But when I pointed to the headphones in her bag, she couldn't deny it. I opened her bag, pulled out the headphones, and told her to pack her stuff and leave. She freaked out, yelling that I was overreacting, but I had already set up a small security camera in the living room, aimed toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I showed her the footage. She was busted. I reminded her of the money she had stolen from our parents, the forged signatures, and her endless lies. I told her if she didn't leave right then, I'd call the cops. She tried to call my bluff, but I stood firm, calm, and resolute. She left that night, cursing me all the way out. As soon as she was gone, I felt a huge weight lift off my chest, though I was still furious. A couple of days later, Dad called. My sister had been blowing up their phones, claiming I blackmailed her. I explained I had video proof of her stealing, and I warned her I'd use it if she tried anything again. Dad sided with me, saying they were also considering pressing charges. My sister had always been a whirlwind of chaos, but the depths of her manipulation and deceit reached new lows when she forged our parents' signatures and scammed them out of a substantial sum of money. As messed up as it sounds, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, the looming legal pressure would make her realize she couldn't keep getting away with screwing people over. Things calmed down for a while, but then one evening, I found a note on my car, a thinly veiled threat: "Stop threatening me or you'll regret it." My car door had a fresh scratch too. I snapped a picture, kept the note, and immediately suspected her. After all, who else would have a reason to threaten me? I texted my parents, and my dad was furious but reminded me that we had no solid proof. I briefly thought about calling the cops, but without concrete evidence, it felt pointless. That same week, my sister showed up at my door around midnight, looking completely shaken, tears in her eyes. She claimed she had pissed off the wrong people, had nowhere else to go, and was begging me to let her in. I was immediately suspicious. Given her track record, this was just another one of her schemes. I cracked the door just enough to speak to her, leaving the chain on for safety. She tried to guilt-trip me, talking about how we used to be close, how we were family. I told her outright that I didn't trust her. I reminded her of the note on my car and told her to leave. She pouted, called me a monster, and stormed off. The next day, I told my parents about the late-night visit. Dad suggested I invest in better security, so I upgraded my locks and installed a more advanced camera system. Meanwhile, my parents were still reeling from her betrayal. They had decided it was time to press charges if she didn't start paying them back. At first, she ignored their requests, making excuses, until Dad gave her one last warning. If she didn't start paying, they'd involve the law. They even consulted an attorney, who confirmed that she could be charged with forgery and financial abuse. Dad's frustration was palpable, but he was resolute. Mom, though heartbroken, stood by Dad. My uncle, who had had enough of her games, also got involved, urging them to take a stand. A family meeting was scheduled, and we all gathered at my parents' house. Dad, Mom, Uncle, me, and of course, my sister. She showed up late, acting like the victim, all high and mighty. Dad presented the evidence, and Uncle told her to stop lying. In true form, she spun a ridiculous tale, claiming it wasn't that much money and that she'd pay it back eventually. We all just stared at her, not sure whether to laugh or cry. Dad was firm: either commit to paying it back, or we'd take legal action. She screamed that we were all conspiring to ruin her life and stormed out. A couple of weeks later, she still hadn't made any effort to repay what she owed. Dad, beyond frustrated, said he was done waiting. He instructed their attorney to draft official papers to demand repayment, warning her that if she didn't respond, they'd file a lawsuit. In response, she tried to stir up more family drama by calling a distant cousin and claiming that our parents were abusive and that I was blackmailing her. The cousin, obviously unaware of the truth, called Dad. Dad explained the full story, and the cousin immediately apologized, realizing the situation wasn't at all what my sister had portrayed. Another door slammed in her face. She went radio silent for a while, but eventually, when she realized my parents weren't backing down, she reached out to their attorney. She agreed to a legally binding repayment plan. She'd pay a set amount every month until the money was repaid in full. If she missed a single payment, they could immediately take her to court. My dad, exhausted but relieved, shared the news with me. Apparently, she'd managed to scrape together a few part-time jobs, though she was still behind on her own bills. For the first time, my parents began to see some repayments trickling in. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. They were still dealing with the aftermath, though. The stolen money had put them in a tough spot, and it would take time for them to fully recover. My uncle, ever the realist, checked in on them regularly to make sure they were okay. He didn't have much faith that she'd keep up with the repayments, but for now, there was a glimmer of justice. As for me, I kept going about my life. I still worked at the warehouse, hanging out with friends, and staying vigilant. My security cameras were always rolling. I wasn't about to let her pull any more stunts. Sometimes, I feel strange about how everything turned out. She's my sister, after all. But the damage she caused was monumental. She drained our parents' finances, nearly pulled me into her web, and showed zero remorse for any of it. If a legal arrangement is the only thing that will force her to face the consequences of her actions, then so be it. She tried to scam our parents, got kicked out, and then had the nerve to beg me for a place to stay. In the end, I gave her a brutal wake-up call, holding her accountable for once in her life. Some people might say I was harsh, but honestly, I'd rather be harsh than let her destroy my life, like she almost did with my parents. If she wants to fix her life, she can continue working those part-time jobs, making those repayments, and stop blaming everyone else for her problems. But that's on her, not me. So that's the saga of my entitled sister, who scammed our parents and tried to mooch off me, only to learn the hard way that I'm not the naive kid she used to bully. At this point, I'm just glad to have my apartment back in one piece and my parents free from her constant manipulations. It's not a perfect ending, but it's progress. She's still out there, probably complaining about how unfair life is, but at least now, she knows that some actions have consequences. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted. No more drama, no more lies, and no more letting her get away with things just because we share DNA. Welcome to reality, sis.